will discuss Land Bank's financing facility for agri and fishery sector. Let us all welcome Mr. Edgardo S. Lozano, Vice President for Programs and Management Department of the Land Bank of the Philippines. Sir Edgardo, nandito po ba?
Hello, can you hear me now?
Ayan. Good afternoon, sir.
Okay. So, thank you, Ms. Karen, and good afternoon to everyone. And may I say also magandang Jensen. First of all, I would like to thank USAID and, of course, the city government of Jensen and the other organizers for having us this afternoon to discuss with you the bank's lending program for the agriculture and the fisheries sector. And of course, we also would like to hear from you, your experiences and the current constraints that you have now, unfortunately, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and see how we can be more responsive to your needs. So we have these programs, and basically, if these are not addressing squarely the concerns you have now, and then we would like to look at how we can be more relevant to address your needs, But at the onset, please allow me to state that in most of these programs, we are using the bank's internal fund, and that of course includes the money of the private depositors. So there is a corresponding cost to the fund that we're using for credit, and that affects the interest rates of these loans. But for special lending programs, particularly, or for example, our partnership with the DA-ACPC, where we are provided with external funds for credit, then we can provide concessional rates, and that may be instructed by the fund owner. Okay. Next slide, please. So in line with the objective of the forum, which is to discuss the available financing package to support the agri-fishery-based MSMEs, and of course that would include the cooperatives because they can also be classified as MSMEs based on asset level to cope with the pandemic. So we will present first the two programs, the iRescue, you may already have heard of this, and the ERI's AR-based lending program, and these are developed in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we move on our discussion to include the parameters of our co-op and SME lending programs, which we continue to offer even before the pandemic, we continue to offer during the pandemic, and even after the COVID-19, which we hope na sana matapos na kaagad yan, no? Kasi it provided us already lots of sacrifices. Okay, so next slide, please. So the first program is what we call the iRescue, or the Interim Rehabilitation Support to Cushion Unfavorably Affected Enterprises by COVID-19. So next slide. So this is developed to support the MSMEs, the co-ops, and the MFIs that are adversely affected by COVID-19. And in fact, it addresses the liquidity position or the need for additional working capital of the borrower to revive or continue its business operation. And in the case of the co-ops and MFIs, to provide them additional capital for relending to their members or to their clients. Next slide. So the program is interim. So this is only available up to December 31st, 2020, or the end of the year. And it's just like providing the borrower the needed capital to pump prime the business. And after that, we hope it would be able to generate sufficient income to make the business a going concern. So parang temporarily addressing lang yung credit gap. So that's why it's up to December 31st, 2020. No? If there would be additional credit requirement after this, then maybe we'll see if we will extend, there's a need to extend the program, or we can address those requirements with our existing regular lending programs. And then for microenterprises, these are the clients of the conduits that they can borrow from. These are actually the clients of the conduits that they can borrow from them, like for example, the cooperatives, if they are the members of the cooperatives, and also the MFIs. No? And there are two types of credit assistance. The rehabilitation credit program, where we provide additional working capital to the co-ops and SMEs, and also the rehabilitation through loan restructuring. So loan restructuring, we know, an example of this is, for example, we extend the tenor or the repayment period of the loan because the business is adversely affected by the pandemic. So we can restructure the existing loan of the borrower. Next slide, please. So this is the rehabilitation credit program for SMEs. The eligible projects or the loan purpose is an emergency fund for working capital. We can provide you up to 85% of the actual need, provided the total loan exposure, including the existing loan of the borrower, will be within the repayment capacity, and this will be as computed by the land bank. So the 15%, usually this is the labor component. This will be the equity of the borrower. The facility will be a term loan, and we can provide up to 5 years repayment period with a maximum 2 years grace period on the principal payment depending on the cash flow. So titingnan po natin dito yung business cycle so that we can determine yung repayment period of the loan. So if the business is mabilis yung kanyang turnover, then maybe the repayment period would be shorter kasi kaya naman niya mag-generate ng sufficient capital to service its loan obligation. Okay? And then the interest rate is 5% per annum. That would be fixed for 3 years. And then after that, this will be subject to annual repricing, but not lower than 5% per annum. This is quite concessional in the sense that we are not looking at the credit rating of the borrower. Normally, when we provide loan, when we compute for the interest rate, this is also based not only from the benchmark rate in the market, but also on the credit rating of the borrower. Kung siyempre mas mababa ang credit rating niya, mas mataas yung kanyang spread on the loan. But this one, we fixed it at 5% for 3 years. And then after that, we will recalibrate based on the credit rating. Okay, next slide, please. The loan can be paid monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, or annual, depending on the cash flow. And then further, the payment can be made via debit from the existing deposit account with Land Bank, or over the counter, or issuance of post-dated checks and other e-banking channels. So the bank continues to develop some e-banking facilities where we can use under the program for the convenience of the borrower to pay their loan obligation. No? For the fees, we waive the application fee, the CIBI fee, the commitment, and the pre-termination fees. The other fees, these are the standard fees and charges, this will apply. And then for the mode of release, it can be released lump sum or staggered depending on the timing that you would need the capital, and it will be credited to the borrower's account that is maintained with the land bank. And then for the collateral or the security, this can be a combination or any or combination of the following: acceptable collateral to the bank, like for example, if the loan was used to acquire machineries and equipment, then that would be used as a chattel mortgage to cover, to be part of the collateral. Or we can require the borrower to provide us post-dated checks to cover maturing principal and interest amortization. Okay, next slide. So that's for the SMEs. And then the credit program for cooperatives and MFIs, the eligible loan purpose is that this is a wholesale lending facility for livelihood financing. So essentially, the bank provides additional fund to the cooperatives and MFIs for on lending to the small farmers and fishers and MSME clients. The amount of loan is equivalent to 85% of the requirement of the co-op and the MFIs. And we compute that 85% based on the master list of newly approved sub-loans that the borrower will submit to Land Bank. Or if there is no sub-loans yet, then the master list of the potential borrowers and their corresponding loan amount will be submitted to Land Bank, and 85% of that will be the amount of loan that we will provide. The credit facility is also a term loan, and this is payable up to maximum of 5 years. So next slide, please. The interest rate is the same with the SMEs. This is 5% per annum, fixed for 3 years, and then subject to annual repricing thereafter. Okay. But for the cooperatives and MFIs, we also prescribe a pass-on rate ceiling. So if the borrower is small farmers and fishers, the pass-on rate would be a maximum of 12% per annum, inclusive of other charges. And if the borrower is not an SFF, not a small farmer and fisher, but the loan purpose is for agricultural use, then the maximum pass-on rate would be 12% per annum. Then for non-agricultural purpose, it's 15% per annum. So it basically shows the bias of the bank on small farmers and fishers, because what we would like to do here is that the small farmers and fishers would also be enjoying the concessional rate that we are providing to the borrowers. Okay. Next slide. And then the loan can be repaid either upon maturity of the promissory note per batch, and then the interest would be payable monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, in arrears or lump sum upon the maturity of the promissory note. And the payment can be made through debit from existing deposit account with Land Bank, over-the-counter, issuance of PDCs, and other e-banking channels. Next slide. The collateral requirement is simply the assignment of the sub-promissory notes that are already available at the time of loan release, and including the underlying collateral. And of course, the assignment of proceeds of the guarantee claims from the Field Guarantee Corporation, the Credit Surety Fund, and insurance claims from the Philippine Crop Insurance Corporation. If the sub-promissory notes are not yet available at the time of loan release, then we require the borrower to provide us the post-dated checks to cover the principal and interest amortization of each promissory note. Next slide. So this is the rehabilitation through loan restructuring. So for example, if the borrower has an existing loan with Land Bank, and because it is affected, or the business is affected by the pandemic and its repayment capacity is affected, then we can restructure the loan by providing extension of the repayment period or other means of loan restructuring. And we can also provide refinancing. So extend natin yung term loan, yung term ng loan, then at the same time, we also provide additional fresh funds to revive or to continue to operate its business by providing it operational fund. Okay. Then the loan tenure would be up to a maximum of 10 years with up to 3 years grace period on principal and up to 1 year grace period on interest. That would be dependent on the cash flow. Then the interest rate would be the same, still 5% per annum, fixed for 3 years, then subject to annual repricing. Mode of payment would be monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, or annually, depending on the cash flow. Okay. Next slide, please. So these are just the pre-processing requirements, just a rundown. Of course, the accomplished loan application form and the registration with the registering agency. If the borrower is a corporate entity, then each registration from the SEC, and if it is a sole proprietor, then with the DTI. This is accompanied by corporate secretary certificate on the submitted documents. Then we also require audited financial statement for the last 3 years, plus the current year financial statement. But we also provide financing for startup businesses or startup entities. No? But for us to be able to provide financing for startups, the borrower must show that it has the capacity to manage the project, to manage the credit. And that capacity is measured in terms of his or her experience in implementing a similar project, or training in implementing a similar project, or the borrower has hired a manager or a personnel that has experience in implementing the said project in its operation. So titingnan natin yan kung may kakayahan siyang mag-implement ng project, we can provide financing. Then part of the processing requirement is also the list of key officers of the firm, then the SIG card of at least one valid government ID, and then also the tax identification number. Next slide. These are the pre-loan release requirements and then the post-loan release requirements. I will not discuss them one by one. Maybe we can, the lending centers of Land Bank will be very glad to explain the documentary requirements. But just would like to mention that for the pre-release, we need a letter request from the borrower that will indicate the amount of loan to be applied and also the number of prospective sub-borrowers. And then the number of prospective sub-borrowers, we should indicate the commodity or the project to be financed so that we can determine the term of the loan. And then the master list of sub-borrowers or sub-PNs to be assigned, because this will be the basis of determining the loan amount, the 85% of the loan amount. Okay. So next slide. Okay, so that's for the iRescue program, which is available until end of the year. The other program, and this is more specifically applicable for cooperatives with members that are agrarian reform beneficiaries. Of course, you know that Land Bank is a creation of the agrarian reform or the land reform program of the government, so may konting bias po ang Land Bank sa ARBs. But this program, next slide please. This program is a partnership with the Department of Agrarian Reform, and this provides financial assistance to disaster-affected ARBOs. Next slide, please. There. And the program will run for 3 years, and this will end by March 15 of 2021. So available na lang po ito until March 15 next year. Okay, next slide. So as I mentioned, this is designed for ARBOs that are affected by calamities and other disasters. And what are these calamities or disasters? Of course, the natural calamities such as typhoons, earthquakes, volcanic eruption, other calamities as declared by the Office of the President and the NDRRMC or the LGU, and also the epidemic or pandemic outbreak of human and or animal disease or plant infestation. So kasama po dito yung COVID-19, kasama dito the likes of the African swine fever, no? As declared by the Department of Health, the Department of Agriculture, or other appropriate government agency. Next slide. So the eligible borrowers are ARB cooperatives and farmers associations with ARB and small farm holder members that are affected by those mentioned calamities. Okay, the criteria is that, of course, they have to be duly registered with the CDA if it is a cooperative, and with the SEC in case of farmers association. Then no adverse findings from the borrower and its principal, with the core management team of a manager, cashier, treasurer, or bookkeeper, and with basic operations and lending manual in place, and with books of accounts. Okay. Next slide. So dalawa po yung loan purpose under the ERISE program. One is for the agri-enterprise and livelihood loans, and this is to augment the funds of the ARBO for on lending to their members for the implementation of agri-enterprise and livelihood projects. And this is available 1 year from the official date of declaration of the state of calamity or the disaster in the area. The other loan purpose is for provident loans, and this is intended to support the member for house repair. Kung halimbawa nabagyo yung bahay and kailangang i-repair, then we can also provide additional funds. Or even to finance the repair naman ng opisina ng ARBO, which is also affected or could also be affected by typhoons or other natural calamities. No? And the same thing, it is available 1 year from the official date of declaration of the state of calamity or disaster in the area. Okay. Next slide. So how much pwede pong maipautang natin? Per ARBO is up to 1 million. For the agri-enterprise and livelihood loan, the interest rate is 3% per annum and the pass-on rate is 6% per annum. The loan tenor is up to 3 years, payable monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, or lump sum. Then we can also provide grace period depending on the projected cash flow. For the provident loan, for house repair of the individual farmer member, we can provide up to 10,000. And for the ARBO office repair, we can provide up to 100,000. The interest rate would be 0%, and then with the pass-on rate to the member at 3% per annum. The loan tenor would also be 3 years, okay, with the necessary grace period of not more than 2 years. Next slide, please. So again, we waive the application fees, the CIBI, the commitment, and then the other pre-termination fees. The other standard fees will apply. Then for the collaterals and securities, the assignment of sub-borrowers' promissory notes with the underlying collaterals, if any, and then the assignment of insurance claims. And then for provident loans, also the assignment of the sub-borrowers' promissory notes and underlying collaterals. Next slide. For the documentary requirements, since this is a program partnership with the DAR, we need an endorsement by the DAR of the eligible ARBOs. And then the other requirements are the basic ones, the photocopy of the registration certificate of the articles of cooperation and bylaws, and then the other documents that are, like for example, the board resolution authorizing the ARBO to borrow, the officers that are authorized to negotiate with the bank, then the list of incumbent members, and then the financial statements. But if the ARBO is already an existing borrower of the bank and these documents have already been submitted, then hindi na po kailangang i-resubmit, except when there is a need to update these documents. Okay, next slide. Then we also need a farm plan and budget, or a very simple business plan, depending on the project. Pero kung ang project niya halimbawa is rice or corn production, and then hindi na po natin kailangan ng business plan, we simply need a farm plan and budget, which will be the basis for determining the loan amount. Next slide, please. Okay. So just a rundown of the land bank agri-lending programs for cooperatives and SMEs. Next slide. Ang pwede po natin pautangin dito yung mga kwalipikadong cooperatives and micro, small, and medium enterprises. These are the ones na registered with the registering agencies like the CDA and the DTI and the SEC. And then pwede po natin sila pautangin for agri-fishery production, acquisition of the fixed assets, working capital, relending, rediscounting facility, and then for the commodity loan. And then the loanable amount will be up to 80% of the project cost. May mga programa po tayo na, like for example, the Sulong Saka, where individual farmers are qualified or eligible as borrowers. And then so pag ang farmer ang borrower po natin, o farmer or fisher ang borrower po natin, we can provide up to 90% of the project cost. as the loan amount. And then 10%, usually labor, ang equity ng small farmer or fisher. Then for rediscounting, up to 85% of the outstanding balance of the sub-promissory notes being rediscounted. So the interest rate would be dependent on the prevailing market rate and the spread based on the credit rating of the borrower. But for a small farmer under Sulong Saka program, the interest rate is 5% per annum fixed for the term of the loan. And then for rediscounting, we also have a passed-on prescribed rate of 5% for SFF, and then a maximum of 12% per annum pass-on rate. And then for other borrowers, interest rate of 5% and then maximum pass-on rate of 12%, pero pwede silang mag-charge ng reasonable service fees. Okay. Next slide, please. So these are just the basic risk asset acceptance criteria na ito po ay tinitingnan ng bangko para malaman kung qualified yung borrower, like for the character, no adverse findings on the borrower, no adverse findings on the principals, for example, the officers of the cooperative. And then for the capacity, the well-defined source of prepayment and the track record. But again, we can finance startups. Okay? Next slide, please. So I just would like to emphasize two of the programs that we have. This is the Sulong Saka program or high value crop financing, where the bank has allocated 10 billion for the program that will be relent to farmers cultivating high value crops. And the eligible projects are the production of high value crops, establishment of nursery, for example, budwood gardens, and then new plantation, and also the acquisition of post-harvest facilities. Then the other one is the Sustainable Aquaculture Lending Program or the SALP, or ang tawag po namin dito yung pagsasakang pantubig. So this is a growership program for fisheries that is anchored on an institutional buyer or processing canning company linked with small farmers, fishers, micro, small, and medium enterprises. For example, we have a farmers group that has a contract growing arrangement with a canning company, then pwede po natin silang mabigyan ng pautang. Then the eligible projects would include the breeding, hatchery, nursery, production, grow out, culture of fish and other species, seaweed farming and processing, processing of fishery products, trading, and other ancillary services. Okay, next slide. So these are just the documentary requirements. Basically, it's the same nung nabanggit po natin kanina ng mga earlier programs. And this depend on the type of the borrower and the type of the project. Okay? So kung tayo po ay interesado sa mga lending programs, what we can do is that we can approach the lending centers of the bank na nandun po sa pinakamalapit po sa inyo. So for example, for the Gensan, we have our lending center in Gensan, and this is headed by AVP Eden Hapitana. So pwede po natin kausapin or the account officers that are handling agri and fishery projects. So we have about 48 lending centers nationwide. Pwede po natin silang lapitan for our financing requirement, and they would be very happy to explain to you, provide loan orientation, and to support you in your requirement. So yun lang po at maraming salamat.